Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your host, Spratt from Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by Schatz from Football Outsiders. It's been a couple of months, actually, since we've gotten together to have our podcast, so it's going to be a show with a lot of details about what's been going on over the last couple of months. But before we get started with that, let me remind everyone that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. They believe that accuracy matters, and it shows since they've won the Daily Fantasy Accuracy Competition for the past 3 seasons. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, head over to FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. Aaron, the reason we timed this episode when we did is because you have a couple of articles coming out on ESPN this week, and we're basically going to be talking about all the content of those on the show, but can you give everyone a little bit more specific information about what you covered and where and how they can read it?
Absolutely. Now, these are ESPN Insider articles, so they do require an ESPN Insider subscription, but as I often tell people, it's a pretty good deal. There's a lot of good writers for that. You don't just get Football Outsiders. And, you also get Kuiper and McShay and Casey Joyner and Pro Football Focus and a bunch of other stuff from other sports. But what we did was our initial projections for 2016. Now, in past years when I've done this article in May, I did this kind of quick and dirty projection system that was kind of hacked together. This year, these projections are based on the system that we restructured and improved last June and used in the book last year. So that was the system that had Minnesota as a playoff contender and had the Jets as a playoff contender and didn't have Miami winning the division, as opposed to the early projections we did last May, which had a lot of mistakes in them that we corrected when we improved the system. So these should be more accurate, and it's really just a first look at what Football Outsiders Almanac 2016 is going to say about the 2016 season. That being said, of course, our projections don't encompass every possible thing that has happened to teams. These are objective projections that are based on trends over the last dozen years. There's obviously a lot of subjective elements that help guide how well teams are going to play next year, and we can talk about those things too, where we feel the objective projections are right or wrong.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to touch on a lot of the different teams that you guys have projected, but I want to encourage everyone to check out the article because that's where you'll find every last team with good writing by you and their projected record and strength of schedule. But I'm just going to go in the general order that you've gone in the articles, and let's get started in the AFC with the AFC East, where, not much of a surprise here, Aaron, the New England Patriots are projected to win the division, although a little bit closer than in some recent seasons, with a 10-6 record over the Bills at 9-7. The Patriots are obviously a very interesting team, and it kind of starts with Tom Brady's eligibility, I guess. So at this point, are the projections assuming that Brady's going to be out for the first 4 games of the season? And what would that do to their projected total of wins this year?
Right. Now, of course, I should remind everybody a little bit about how the projections work. These represent sort of the average of a range of possibilities for each team. And they tend to group towards 8-8 because that's just the nature of objective progressions, because there's all kinds, when you look at the last 12 years, there's all kinds of possibilities where bad teams suddenly become good and good teams suddenly become bad. And that's all kind of baked into how projections work. Right. I did tweak them a little bit for ESPN to spread out the records a little bit so that they're a little bit more like what realistic win-loss records look like at the end of a season, but not much. No team changed its win-loss total by more than 0.9, I think, in the tweaking. So It wasn't like a huge thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, with that in mind, so last year we couldn't figure out what to do about Brady, and we knew there were going to be appeals, and we were going to include the suspension, and then we didn't include the suspension, and we did, and we didn't. So this year, yes, there could be further appeals, but we're going to just take until something happens. We're assuming Tom Brady does not play the first 4 games of the season. Now, the offensive DVOA projection, sort of average of possibilities for the Patriots, people may be surprised by what it is with Brady healthy. It's only 10.8%. It's down a little bit from last year, just sort of natural regression towards the mean. But with Garoppolo as the quarterback, the projection is minus 4.6%. That is a lot lower.
Definitely.
But it doesn't change the total of wins as much as you might think. It only goes from, we would expect them to win 2.5 out of the 4 games with Brady, and it's 1.9 with Garoppolo. The biggest issue, obviously, is playing in Arizona, since Arizona is one of the top 2 teams in our projections for next year, along with Seattle. And that's going to be a really hard game without Tom Brady. But 0.6 wins doesn't sound like a lot. At the same time, because all of these teams are grouped so much towards 8-8 in projections like this, 0.6 wins is more than it would be in the real regular season. Because in the real regular season, the span of there'll be more teams that are 5-11 and more teams that are 11-5, and one game, these things, they turn from 70% possible wins to wins and losses, not percentages. So it means something that Brady's going to be out. It means enough to make the division closer, but it doesn't mean enough to make the Patriots not favored. Plus, I'll point out that there's a little bit of rounding here. The mean wins for the Patriots is 10.3, and for Buffalo it's 8.6. So they're actually not apart by 1 mean win. They're apart by 1.5.
Yeah, that makes sense. The Patriots, they really are pretty well equipped to handle time without Brady because, obviously they were great on offense last year, 5th in offensive DVOA, but they were good on defense and special teams too, 12th in defense, 5th in special teams. So they're a pretty well-balanced team overall. It seems like anybody, if they can survive without, their premier quarterback, it might be the Patriots.
Right, and they're good on special teams every year, and that does come into play in our special teams projections. Most teams are very inconsistent on special teams from year to year, but Baltimore and New England are good every year, and so Baltimore and New England end up getting projected as the top 2 teams in special teams for next year, and that does matter for those teams.
I want to ask you a broader question about how the projections work, but I think the Patriots provide a good opportunity to do so. Up on FootballOutsiders.com, there's an NFL draft report card that's compiled by Sterling, is it Zai or Z?
Sterling Z.
Sterling Z. It's really interesting. Basically, he's combining a bunch of different experts and their opinions on the NFL draft together. And based on that compilation, the Patriots had the 3rd worst draft, in particular because they didn't address some of their need positions, like defensive end after trading Chandler Jones and running back. Is that sort of stuff factored into this? Or are you anticipating that teams are going to get some plug-and-play guys that can help this year? How does drafting impact how these projections work?
Yeah, we can't really judge draft picks. We don't feel like we're in a position to judge how good certain draft picks are. So the variables that are used in a system like this are going to try to be as objective as possible. Now, surprisingly, there's a personnel change variable for both offense and defense. For offense, it's based on the change at skill positions other than quarterback, because quarterback is considered differently. On defense, it's based on approximate value over replacement of defensive players going in and out of a team. So we were surprised that when we tested this last year when we were building the new system, we found that adding the sort of estimated rookie approximate value of defenders from the first 2 rounds improved our defensive projections. But adding the estimated approximate value of rookie offensive players from the first 2 rounds didn't improve our projections. So in reality, based on this system as it is right now, the drafting of rookies on offense, except for quarterback, has no impact on the projection. Now, that's where subjective comes in, right? That's why in the book we run our numbers, and then we have a whole chapter with 2,500 words that explains why we think certain things. So the only position that matters is because for every team we do a projection for their quarterback that is separate from the team. It's based on what that player has done in the past, which, of course, a player's teammates will impact, but it's not based on what team he's on now. So we have to take our Q-base system into account for young quarterbacks. So, for example, Jared Goff has a really good Q-base, so he's projected to be really good. If Paxton Lynch was listed as the starting quarterback for Denver, he does not have a good Q-base, so our projection for Denver would be even worse than it already is with Mark Sanchez at quarterback. But adding offensive players doesn't have much impact. And defensive players, it does. Taking defensive players in the first 2 rounds does add value to projections. That's a big part of Jacksonville's projection being better for this year on defense. But we're not going to judge which picks were good or bad. We just assume that, in general, taking defensive players in the first 2 rounds leads to improvement on defense, and players from the 3rd round and below don't have much impact in their first year.
Yeah. We'll get to those other teams you mentioned in a little bit, but let's close up the East by talking about the Bills and the Jets. So the Jets finished 9th in total DVOA last year, while the Bills finished 12th. So pretty close together, with the Jets being slightly ahead. But I noticed the Jets are projected for 6-10, while the Bills are projected for 9-7. How much of that is because of strength of schedule, and are there other sort of major factors kind of involved in that spread?
A lot of it is about regression and the plexiglass principle, which is the idea that teams that dramatically improve or decline from one year to the next, teams that dramatically improve from one year to the next will tend to decline the following year, and teams that dramatically decline from one year to the next will tend to improve the following year. And this is true not only of teams in general, but of specific units. And that matters because the Jets improved significantly last year on both offense and defense, so the system would expect them to fall back a little bit. And the Bills dramatically declined on defense last year, really badly. I mean, they'd been number 2 the year before and were something like 26th the last year. And so the system expects them to bounce back and improve. Then you add on to that the fact that the Jets have no quarterback. The Jets would be projected for like a whole extra mean win if we plugged Ryan Fitzpatrick into the system as their starting quarterback instead of Geno Smith. And by the way, if we plugged in Christian Hackenberg, it would be worse. The other difference is the schedule, which is a big deal because, first of all, our projections, we'll get to this in a few minutes, but our most controversial projection for next year is that we have the Chiefs dominating the AFC West, and the Jets have to play them, and no one else in the division does. And the Jets have to play the Patriots with Brady, while the Bills and Miami each get a game against Garoppolo. So those are big differences for these teams. The Jets also, I should point out, lost 4 defensive starters, including Demario Davis and Damon Harrison. Those are hard players to replace. Yes, I know they drafted an inside linebacker to replace Davis, and they could always go to a 3-man line, and then with Leonard Williams, they've got a great 3-man line. But if they go to 4 men, they've got Steve McClendon. It's hard to replace this much value going out. The players they've brought in do not have as much value as the players that left.
Yeah. Okay, let's pivot to the AFC North, which I think for 3 of the teams is pretty much how you would expect it to be going. The Steelers, Bengals, they're both projected to be really good. The Browns are projected to be really bad. But the Baltimore Ravens are the interesting team to me. So they finished 5-11 last year, but they're projected for 10 wins this year, the same number as the 12-4 Bengals last year are projected to win. So I'm curious, what's up with the big rebound there for the Ravens?
Well, one of the interesting things when we redid the system last year was that the injury totals no longer had an effect on our projections. But that doesn't mean injuries don't have an effect, right? So again, we're talking here about plexiglass principle. Baltimore declined significantly last year on both offense and defense from what they had done the year before. We know why that's true. It's because they had so many injuries. They were 30th in the league in adjusted games lost. They lost Terrell Suggs. They lost Steve Smith. They lost Joe Flacco for 6 games. If all these guys come back, and we would expect Baltimore to have an average number of injuries and have their starting quarterback for the most of the year, you've got to expect rebound. And that is just the plexiglass principle, how that often works. Injuries are usually a big reason why teams decline. Get those injured players back, things bounce back. Plus, the defense, the Ravens were 31st in the league in turnovers per drive on defense. And that turnovers is much more inconsistent from year to year than yardage allowed. And usually teams that don't get a lot of turnovers on defense are going to improve on defense the next year. That was one of the big reasons why we expected improvement from the Jets and the Chiefs in 2015, and were correct about both teams.
So I know that this probably isn't a big factor as well, but the Ravens had a ton of draft picks. They actually had 6 extra picks in the draft because of free agent compensation and trade downs. So, I mean, they've added a lot of depth to the team. So I almost feel like they should be better prepared if they do have injuries this year. But obviously they'll have to hope that it's not basically everybody important on the team that gets hurt.
Right, so that's not incorporated into the objective projections. But it is something we know about Baltimore, and I think having all those 4th-round picks doesn't make things better for this year as much as it ensures consistent play year after year down the line. You don't want to have to depend on those fourth-round picks this year. But what you do want is those fourth-round picks to be coached up a year or two from now, to be able to come in, to be able to replace departed free agents. And that is an example of why Ozzie Newsome might be the best general manager in the game and keeps that team consistent year after year. I think if we did a projection system that tried to project how good teams would be over the next 3 years instead of just 1 year, that kind of thing would really matter.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, let's move down to the AFC South, where I was wondering if this was the year where somebody would be projected for an above 500 record, but turns out that is not the case. The Texans are projected to win the division at 8-8, while the other three teams are projected for 7-9. I actually want to start with the Colts because before last year, Andrew Luck in his 3 seasons with the team had won 11 games in each of those 3 seasons. So obviously they had a bad year last year, but injuries, I'm sure, with Luck played a part, and he was just much worse than normal. So I'm wondering, why is it that the Colts aren't expected to be a little bit better this year?
Yeah, I think part of it is just trying to figure out why was Luck so much worse last year, right? So all the system sees is his numbers, and he was much worse last year than he'd been in the past. And so, was that we've got subjective reasons we can explain that away, maybe it was just a slump early. And then he came back from his injury too early and was bad for 2 games. Then he had 1 really good game against Denver, and then that was it for the season. So maybe using his numbers from last season are really not very telling about how good the offense will be. But it's an objective system, so we can't just subjectively tweak that because we feel like it. And the fact is the Colts have never been a great team with Andrew Luck. They've always been a kind of good team that dominated a bad division because of an easy schedule. In addition, that defense is really old. If you include, if you look at their top 13, defensive players, right? So the starters plus the nickelback and Robert Mathis, who's a rotational pass rusher at this point. I believe they have 8 guys who are going to be 30 years old or older. That is some Pittsburgh's defense collapsing a couple of years ago type stuff right there. It is old guys on that defense, and that defense may have some problems.
Well, the Texans are a pretty interesting team to me. They're projected again at 8-8. Maybe that's the best in the division, but still not exactly the hallmark of a good team. But they're very interesting to me because of the Osweiler signing. I know he doesn't have a lot of experience, but does that record basically indicate that the projection system doesn't view him as much of an upgrade, if any, over a Brian Hoyer type?
Right. I mean, it's really kind of hard to figure out what to think of a guy who's only played half a season and was kind of average, maybe a little worse than average. But then also remember the other data we have about him is that he has the worst projection in the history of Cubase over 20 years. And I realize he way outplayed that projection last year in his half a season. But it's kind of hard to figure out if he really is anything. I'm guessing he's better than what Cubase thought he was. But I don't know if he's really that much better than Brian Hoyer, especially if you consider that Brian Hoyer didn't throw 6 picks a game during the regular season. That was just in the playoff game. People, I think of that playoff game and think that that's how Brian Hoyer played all year. And that's not how Brian Hoyer played all year. That was just 1 game.
Yeah, for sure. So the Jaguars are really the team that is probably the most interesting in the division. I mean, they've been kind of written off over the last few years, but they're basically up with the rest of the teams now in projection, and they've done a lot of things to improve their team, especially on defense over the last year, as they've picked some high draft picks in Jalen Ramsey and Myles Jack. And Dante Fowler, who was the 3rd overall pick from 2015, he should be back after an ACL injury cost him last year. So there's a lot of things pointed up for the Jaguars. Is it possible that they'll actually come back and win this division?
And I will say this is an example of where our objective projections do not judge what we think of certain draft picks, right? A Sackseer didn't think Dante Fowler was worth the number 3 overall pick. But I am counting here as a rookie because he didn't play last year, and they get the value of him being the number 3 overall pick in our projection system because that's what he was, even if we don't think he was worthy of it.
Right.
Let's be honest, we also don't think Myles Jack was worthy of the number 36 pick or whatever he was. We think he's better than that, so the kind of probably evens out. The offense put up huge fantasy numbers, but wasn't really that good by DVOA. It was only 21st. The system expects a little bit of a step back. That's the sort of plexiglass principle thing again. but expects a lot of improvement from the defense because of all of that young talent added. So I do think Jacksonville's definitely in the mix. I think that there is a reasonable reason to believe that a young offense like that is not going to take a step back, and so that the team may be better than our projections say. I'll tell you, I really like right now the idea of the Jaguars winning the AFC South in 2017.
Okay.
But I do think they're going to be in the mix this year, too.
Okay, one more division to go in the AFC, and it's, to me, the most interesting one. So it's the AFC West, which I think you teased earlier that the Chiefs are kind of running away with in the projections with a 12-4 record. I mean, I'm not really surprised that the Chiefs are up there. They closed last year with 10 straight wins. I think we know how good they are, but
they had a better season-long DVOA last year than Denver did. They were 5th and Denver was 8th.
Yeah, it seemed like the Broncos really timed their success well and into the playoffs. But still, having the Broncos drop to 7-9 seems pretty dramatic. I mean, they won a lot of games last year. Obviously, they won the Super Bowl. And 2, they were 8th in total DVOA. And obviously, offense was a major problem there, 25th in offensive DVOA. But they were far and away the best defensive DVOA team. Can't they follow a similar formula for success this year? I mean, and is Mark Sanchez like that much worse than what Peyton Manning was last year?
No, I don't expect their offense is going to really get worse. I do think Mark Sanchez sounds probably like he'll be worse than what Brock Osweiler was last year.
Fair.
And Paxton Lynch, like I said, Cubase really not a big fan of Paxton Lynch. Really easy schedule, put up really big numbers against a really easy schedule. Plus, you just can't expect much from rookie quarterbacks anyway. Don't get blindsided by how good the class of 2012 was in its rookie years. Most rookie quarterbacks are not that good. Even number 1 picks, even guys that our projection systems love, like Jared Goff, are not that good as rookies. So if Paxton Lynch comes in, I mean, you can't really expect anything from them. But as far as Denver, what the real problem is here is the likelihood that they repeat that amazing defensive performance. I mean, the fact is that, I talk about this a lot, especially before each season. Offense is more consistent than defense. So when we project defense, all the teams group more towards average than they do for offense because the range of possible performances for every team is so much wider for defense than it is for offense, which means that teams rarely are legendary quality on defense for 2 straight seasons. So Denver was the 8th best defensive DVOA of all time, somewhere around 26% better than average. The only team in the last 25 years that was 20% better than average on defense for 2 straight seasons was Baltimore in 1999 and 2000. A lot of the top defenses of the last 2 decades have been just good the next year. Not great, just good. And that is a good example of what's likely to happen to Denver. They end up with the best defensive projection of any team for this year, but the likelihood is that they're not going to be 25% better than average. They're going to be like 10 or 11% better than average. Like the 2001 Ravens, for example, were 4th in defensive DVOA, 12.5% better than average. Okay? That was less than half as good as they were the year before. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2003 dropped from 1st to 3rd in defensive DVOA. Okay, they were a little better. They were like 17% better than average. But again, not as good as they were the year before. And if you take Denver and you give them the same bad offense they had last year, and then you give them a defense that's 4th or 5th in the league, not 1st, they're no longer a Super Bowl contender. Now they're the Rams or the Texans from last year. They're a team with a pretty good defense and a really bad offense, not a team with a legendary defense. And when you start with the fact that DVOA does not believe they were as good as their record in the regular season to begin with, because they're only 8th, but because of the way wins and losses worked out and the way close games worked out, they ended up with the number 1 seed, and then they played awesome in the playoffs. But you start from 8th, and then you take a lot away from a legendary defense, even though it's still one of the best defenses in the league, you end up with an average team.
I think the Broncos will be the team that surprises most of our readers the most. But the team that surprised me, or the projection that surprised me the most, was actually the Oakland Raiders at just 6-10. it really feels like the Raiders were kind of on the up and up. They added a lot in free agency with Kelechi Osemele, Bruce Irvin, and Sean Smith, and they were 14th in DVOA last season. I would have sort of picked them as one of the teams outside the top 8 to enter the top 8 of sort of the best teams in the league this year.
Yeah.
So why is it that they only have 6 projected wins?
This is the one I disagree with too. Right? This is the objective projection that I disagree with. It's the plexiglass principle, right? It's the Raiders improved so dramatically last year on both sides of the ball that you, especially on offense, that you would expect that improvement to decline a little bit this year. And it's not like they've added a lot of talent. They're just expecting their young talent to get better, but they didn't really add that much on defense. They lost a couple of guys, they add a guy or two, but it's not. They add Irvin, they add Sean Smith, but they lose Woodson and they lose Justin Tuck, and it's they add Osemele, but they already had a good offensive line. It's I understand why the projection comes out this way. But I'm always trying to improve the system, and I'm always trying to figure out a way to identify those teams that are not going to take a step back after a big step forward, where the big step forward is an indicator that this team is building something special, and trying to find a variable that, objectively you put into the system and it will identify that. And I just haven't been able to do it yet, so I can't, make that up for the Raiders. But I will say subjectively, I would expect that the Raiders are going to be better than this projection, and the Chargers are not going to be as good as the projection that has them at 8-8. And Kansas City probably is not going to be as good as the projection that has them at 12-4. I don't think the Raiders are better than Kansas City. I think Kansas City is the favorite in this division, clearly. But I think the Raiders are better than this projection says. They're more likely to be 8-8 or 9-7. Although I will point out that, remember also, Kansas City has one more home game than it had a year ago because it played in London a year ago. The Raiders have one fewer home game than they had a year ago because they lose a game where they have to play in Mexico City against Houston, and I can't imagine that's going to be an overwhelmingly Raiders crowd. That's not the black hole when you play in Mexico City. I'm sure there's plenty of Houston fans there. And that does matter, that those teams have a different amount of home games than they had a year ago. Although Kansas City did win its London game last year.
Yeah, Aaron, I have to figure that this type of approach with the projections makes the most sense. I bet that this happens, the plexiglass principle with these young teams happens more than 50% of the time. But it does seem to me like between the Raiders and the Jaguars, 2 teams with younger quarterbacks, one of them could definitely sort of maintain their step forward, if not improve this year.
Right. So that is incorporated in the system because of each quarterback having a projection that's separate from the team, and that projection does expect young quarterbacks to improve. So that is already incorporated for Jacksonville and Oakland.
Okay. Well, great. Before we move over to the NFC, I'm going to remind everyone again that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. Their slogan is Accuracy Matters, and it shows since they've won the Daily Fantasy Accuracy Competition for the past 3 seasons. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, check out FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. All right, let's start over in the NFC East in the same order that we did it in the AFC. This division is also interesting because there's one team that's sort of standing out from the pack in a way that I wouldn't have really expected going into this. The Dallas Cowboys are projected to go 10-6, while the other 3 teams in the division are projected to go 6-10. Now, obviously, Romo's health, and I guess Des Bryant's health just as much, honestly, you can really see the path to the Cowboys having that kind of success again this year. But some of the teams that are going 6-10 might be more surprising to people. The Redskins sort of in particular stand out here because they won 9 games last year, and while they weren't as good in DVOA, they were 15th in DVOA and 12th in weighted DVOA. So playing better toward the end of the season. Is this, again, a plexiglass principle sort of situation with the Redskins, or are there other things going on with their lower projection?
Yeah, first thing is playing better towards the end of the season does not make you better the next year.
Yeah.
I know it does. It's totally counterintuitive, but it's absolutely true. Being better in weighted DVOA does not make you better the next year. Then what matters is how good you were overall. Otherwise, yeah, it's totally a plexiglass principle situation. especially because it's a plexiglass principle situation, not only with the offense overall, but with Kirk Cousins.
Right.
Kirk Cousins was so much better last year than he had been in his first 3 seasons that you do ask yourself, like, is that really who he is? Most time when you have a guy who's not good for 3 years and then really good for 1 year, he's not really as good as he is in that fourth year.
Sure.
And that's a lot of what's going on here. Plus, the defense, yes, they added Josh Norman, but they lost Terrence Knighton. They lost, who was, I believe, Jason Hatcher. They're just not, it's not a very good defense overall. They had a high level of turnovers last year, not as high as like Arizona or Carolina, but high. That's probably going to come back to the pack a little bit. They had a really good, they were really good at stopping short yardage runs last year, and that actually tends to be a negative indicator for the following year. If you're really, really good at stopping short yardage runs, you're usually not quite as good at it the next year. So, I mean, does the 6-10 for Washington look kind of probably, maybe are they better than that? I guess a little bit. Yeah, but do I feel like they're better than their projection in the same way I do about Oakland? No, I think this projection is probably a lot more likely than, if you talked about the playoff teams last year and you said which of the teams from last year's playoffs is going to collapse by at least 3 wins, wouldn't your answer be Washington? I mean, it would be Carolina because they won 15 games.
Or would it? We'll be discussing that in a little bit, Aaron.
What?
I said, or would it? We'll be discussing that in a little bit, Aaron.
Right. Other than Carolina, because teams don't go 15-1 2 straight years. I'm sorry for you that they don't. But wouldn't your answer be Washington? I mean, which is the team that's going to fall out of the playoffs? The answer would be Washington.
Yeah, I definitely think it's the most obvious. And there's actually another team in the NFC East that I think might kind of be good, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Obviously, the projections don't think so because they have the New York Giants going 6-10, but I kind of like what the Giants did over the offseason. So they added Olivier Vernon from the Dolphins and Damon Harrison from the Jets, and I feel like their defensive line might have just become elite again. Vernon had 55 sacks and pressures last year, which was 4th most in the league behind J.J. Watt, Von Miller, and Carlos Dunlap. But he only had 7.5 sacks, so a lot more pressures than sacks. Meanwhile, I think this kind of went under the radar last year, but Jason Pierre-Paul was actually really good last year. He just had 1 sack, but he had 39 pressures from Week 9 to the end of the season. That was the 3rd most in the game behind Von Miller and Olivier Vernon, his new teammate. So is it possible that the Giants' defensive line just became like sort of the vintage Giants from their Super Bowl heyday?
Yes. Well, probably not that good, but pretty good. And I will say that the projection has their defense improving dramatically, right? Last year, they were one of the worst defenses in the league that was not New Orleans. I mean, New Orleans was on another planet
Yes,
compared to everybody else. But then there was a group of defenses that were like really bad between 28th and 31st, but nowhere near New Orleans. That group was San Diego, the Giants, Chicago, Cleveland, right? Okay. The Giants' projection for defense, their average projection, is to be average. So that's a significant improvement on defense. We definitely see significant improvement. They added a lot of value. In the added value personnel change on defense variable, including draft picks, they are 2nd behind only Tampa Bay. So the defense will be better.
Yeah.
But we've got the offense declining a little bit, and some of that is plexiglass principle because they've been back and forth the last couple of years between being really bad and being average. But, they were really bad 3 years ago, and then they were slightly below average 2 years ago, and slightly below average last year. And Eli Manning is getting older, and they lost Ruben Randall, and I don't know if Victor Cruz is healthy. I mean, I will say that in the personnel change variable for offense, I didn't give them credit for getting Victor Cruz back because Victor Cruz hasn't played for 2 years.
Yeah,
what do you really expect out of the guy? If Victor Cruz comes back and is better, it is back to what he used to be, then all of a sudden the Giants probably have an average offense, maybe even a kind of good offense, and an average defense. Now you're talking about them as an 8-8, 9-17. But the defense, absolutely better this year. No question about it.
All right. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking to you, Aaron, about the NFC North because it feels like the least surprising set of projections to me. You can tell me if you disagree. It's got the Packers winning at 12-4, both the Vikings and Lions at 9 wins, and the Bears at 7 wins. I mean, honestly, the most interesting thing about the division is they get to play the AFC South and NFC East. So I think it's pretty likely that you could get a wild card team too.
For the dominance of the Seattle-Arizona axis out west, you definitely would predict 3 teams in the playoffs.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say that a devil's advocate would ask why Rodgers, he finished top 6 in DVOA for 6 straight seasons, but fell to 17th last year. Why does he get sort of a bounce back projection while Andrew Luck doesn't? But it's not like I really believe that. I mean, I think everybody would agree that Rodgers should be good again this year.
The answer is pretty clear. Andrew Luck's stats went from good to bad. Aaron Rodgers' stats went from best in the league to average.
Right. That's a big difference.
So they both get a bit of a bounce back. But Andrew Luck's bounce back is probably to average, whereas Rodgers' bounce back is to good.
Yep.
And by the way, let me point out, I think Luck is really better than that. I think that our system is overrating what he did last year, but that's how the system works.
So moving over to the NFC South, this has Carolina winning the division, but only at 9-7, while the Saints and Falcons both go 7-9. So I mean, I think I could be a little biased here, but I feel like the Panthers are the most interesting team because, frankly, their offseason has been super weird. But I want to sort of start with the fact that basically that's a decline of 6 wins compared to last year. And what you said about the 15-1, no team doing that 2 years in a row, I think is definitely true. But is this a plexiglass principle situation, or if you had to split it up? I mean, obviously they lost talent too, Josh Norman especially. How does it sort of unfold here with the down projection for the Panthers?
It's a little bit of the plexiglass, but not as much because the Panthers were really awesome in 2013 too.
Yeah. And
the way that it uses past ratings is that roughly, both for offense and defense, each of 2013 and 2014 are each worth about 1/6 of what 2015 is worth.
Okay.
So while it's dinging them for what they did in 2014, it's not dinging them for what they did in 2013. The loss of the talent on defense is a big deal. Not just Norman, but Jared Allen and Charles Tillman. I don't understand the Norman. I mean, I understand they didn't want to pay him, but let's not be pretending that that's not a big loss.
Well,
right? Especially because I don't know who quite is replacing him because they're also missing Tillman. I mean, are they going to really expect Robert McClain to be a real player for the whole season? That's not good.
I mean, this obviously isn't sort of what we do exactly, but it didn't really make very much sense to me. It's one thing not to re-sign Norman, but why you would rescind his franchise tag? It's not like the team has been, spending all of that money on other players.
Keep him for a year while you're training the guys you drafted.
Yeah, you had an expensive but a free season to use him, so it was kind of weird. And it seemed like it influenced their drafting, which is probably another reason why the Panthers were the worst-rated drafting team according to the report card on Football Outsiders. So check that out, everyone, again. But
another thing I would say as far as regression towards the mean is that they led the league on defense with turnovers ending 19.6% of drives.
That's a huge number. Yeah.
And there's going to be a regression there. I don't think the offensive regression is going to be as much. And I do give them some credit for bringing back Kelvin Benjamin. So, I mean, I think the offense should be good again. I think the problem is that the defense is going to be maybe slightly above average instead of second or third in the league.
We'll see. I think they're going to probably win 11 games or more, but, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of variability in outcomes here. All right, let's jump over to the NFC West. You mentioned before, Aaron, that the Cardinals and the Seahawks are the best 2 teams in the DVOA projections. But what's interesting here is that the Cardinals are the second projected team behind the Seahawks, but are projected to win 1 more game than the Seahawks. Can you sort of break that down for us?
Yeah, right. So Seattle has the higher projected rating, but Arizona has more projected wins. There's a huge schedule difference here because of Tom Brady. If there's any team out there that should be wanting the federal court to put down another extension to make it so Brady can play in the first 4 games, it's the Seattle Seahawks. Because the Cardinals host the Patriots during Brady's suspension. But Seattle has to go to the Patriots, and worse, they have to go to the Patriots in Week 10 when Brady will be back.
Right.
The other difference is because our projections have Green Bay improving a lot and Minnesota being about what they were already last year, it's harder to play Green Bay than Minnesota, and Seattle goes to Green Bay, whereas the Cardinals go to Minnesota. But that difference is not as different as the difference between playing the Patriots at home with Garoppolo and playing the Patriots on the road with Brady. And that essentially decides this division in the mean projections. Obviously, range of possibilities, anything could happen. But if we look at the mean projections, essentially it's decided by the fact that the Patriots are in Arizona, but home against Seattle, and that they have Garoppolo the first time, but Brady the second.
Well, we just flew through 6 divisions in about 45 minutes, so I think that was a pretty impressive work there, Aaron. This has gotten me really excited about everything coming over the offseason, especially the Football Outsiders Almanac. Do you know when that will be coming out so our readers can get prepared to get a lot more details than what's on the ESPN Insider articles?
We're still shooting for mid-July. It may be a little later than that. We're trying to incorporate all the great charting data that you guys did for us last year to make sure we have as much data in the book as possible, get everything written up. We're working through it. Hopefully it'll be a little earlier than last year, but probably not until mid-July. But this gives everybody a little bit of a taste of what's coming and what teams that they should expect good things from for next year. But of course, we'll fiddle with these projections a little bit. They may be a little bit different by the time the book comes out. We may change the systems a little bit. I will always be searching for that elusive variable that spots the team on the rise and tells us whether Oakland is for real or not. But for now, the objective system says no, and my personal feelings say kind of maybe yeah.
Makes sense to me. Well, we'll probably be recording another podcast around when the book is coming out, but definitely check out footballoutsiders.com, where we'll post the episode, and subscribe to the Off the Charts Football podcast, so that way you definitely won't miss any new shows when they come up. Well, thanks again, Aaron, for joining me today. Getting ready for the football season, it's definitely an exciting time. I'll hope to circle back with you in probably a month or two as well.
Sounds good, man. Enjoy your summer for the next couple months, and I hope everybody just feels good getting ready for the next season, because it should be a lot of fun stuff this season.
All right. Appreciate it, Aaron. Bye.